Between you and me, the main reason I look forward to painting model kits and miniatures is because of the weathering. While it can be fun to paint things that are vibrant and factory fresh, there's always something about heavy weathering that's drawn my eye to model painting. And there's no better candidate for weathering than painting up some heavily armored orcs. You see, I'm a Gundam painter at heart. I spent years practicing my skills painting large sections of armor with rust, battle damage, weathering textures, all before I even touched Warhammer. Thankfully, all these techniques transfer perfectly to miniature painting, just at a smaller scale. And I think these orc models will be a perfect way to show off all these effects. These models were 3D printed using STLs from Blueskyminis. I want to give him a huge shout out for providing me these files because I reached out to him months ago, and they were happy to share these files with me so I can make them for a video. I bought from them in the past as well, and they make some really cool 3D print models. So a huge thanks to Blueskyminis for the support. Feel free to check out their stuff. If you're interested, their My Mini Factory page is linked down below in the description. Weathering isn't just about painting. There's a ton you can do before that step to help sell the old and the weathered look. One of my favorite ways is applying a physical texture to the models using putty. While this could be used to make a lot of different kinds of effects, today we're going to be using it to make a really easy armor texture that you would normally find on tanks. Tamiya Basic Putty is a great tool for this. It can stick to a lot of materials other than just plastic, and since today we're working with resin, this will do totally fine. This is a lacquer-based putty that's mainly used for filling in seams on model kits. But one of my favorite ways to also use it is to stipple it onto flat surfaces with an old brush to make a cast texture much like real-life tanks have. It can create a really interesting look to a lot of flat surfaces. The quickest way to do this is to use an old stiff brush to stipple the putty onto your models. Once it starts to get a bit less tacky and becomes a bit more stiff, it's a lot easier to get the exact texture you're looking for. What's great about doing it this way is we're also knocking out two different looks with one technique. Doing this on the power claw will make it look old, rusted, and like it's an old hunk of metal. And then doing it on the armor will give it that cast armor look. Same application, but different results. On a model more based in reality, you'll probably want to look into where these textures would naturally go. But since we're painting space orcs and not a 1940 T-34 tank, I'm just gonna go for rule of cool here. Though generally, I do try to pick out some of the areas that have less surface detail for this step, it just kind of makes it a bit more interesting. I also try to be very sporadic with my application as well, rather than filling it in like a coloring book. This helps it feel a bit more random and natural. Coming up with a basing scheme for an army is always kind of tough, because you kind of have to stick with it for your entire army. But in this case, I don't know if I'm going to ever have an orc army, so kind of just coming up with a one-off basing scheme just for this unit is going to be a breath of fresh air. For these guys, I really wanted to go for a cyberpunk style base. My main inspiration I kind of had for these guys was the City Hunter from Predator 2. I love the vibe of like a big sci-fi alien hunting in the darkness of a human city. I grabbed all my usual basing materials and got started. I wanted to try doing a concrete texture for the floor, and I did some tests off camera to see which one looked better. One of these was done with plaster, and the other one was done with an artist paste. In the end, the artist modeling paste worked the best. This stuff has a bit of flex to it, so when it dries, I don't have to worry about it chipping off. I smeared some of it onto the cork with a really thin popsicle stick. Having this specifically be on cork is going to be really important for a future step. As it was still wet, I grabbed a sponge and started stamping the texture into it. This will really help it look more like actual concrete and give it a coarse texture as well. Once it was dry, I started breaking the cork very lightly so that it won't snap in half, but it will just crack the surface. This was why cork was such an important thing to use underneath it. I ripped off a couple smaller pieces, then glued them to the bases with some hot glue. Once that was done, I wanted to add some more mechanical bits to the bases to sell the city look. I found these plastic knitting meshes from the dollar store that could look really cool as a sort of sci-fi floor texture. I cut them out and carefully glued them in, trying my hardest not to get any of the holes filled up with the glue. After that, I grabbed some thick guitar string that can give the impression of pipes and wires. Guitar string is a really good material because they can bend and hold their shape really easily, and they also have an interesting texture that takes dry brushing and washes really well. Once I got them glued down with some super glue, I trimmed the plastic mesh to fit the curve of the bases. And once that was finally done, I used some AK Interactive texture paste to fill in any of the empty spots of the bases. This stuff dries with a nice gritty texture, which will fit really nice with the rest of the look. I broke up some old model kit bits like jerry cans to place here and there on the bases as well. After that, I finished it off with a light sprinkling of some model railroad ballast. And finally, I grabbed a hobby blade and started scoring in some very fine cracks into the concrete part of the bases. Before I decided on a color scheme, I wanted to think of colors that would show off the weathering really well. In this case, lighter, more vibrant colors would work as a great contrast to some of the dull and grimy textures from the weathering. So for this, I decided on a rich yellow for the base color. Once I got all these guys secured, I broke out the primer. I pretty much always prime with black, that way any parts of the model that I miss with paint will just look like a natural shadow. Vallejo Mecha Primer has always been my go-to, but something tells me it might not stick around on sale for much longer, so I decided to finally give Vallejo's newer primer a try, and it went on smooth. This might become my default primer going forward. Once I got them primed, I started doing some undercoats. Undercoats are important because they can subtly affect your base coat's tone and vibrancy, especially if your base coat is a transparent paint like speed paints or washes. For yellow, I usually start with an undercoat of a dark red followed by bright pink highlights. This works great as an undercoat for yellow. It adds a very nice warm and orangey tone to the yellow. Usually painting basic yellow over a black undercoat will kind of give it this green tint to it, which isn't really what I want to go for here. Once I got the yellow on there, we can already see that just with these few paints and an airbrush, I've already knocked out all my shadows, my tones, base coat, and highlights, just from layering up different paints. I wanted to paint the shoulders white to really show off any of the grit and grime that I paint on. Another great way to make your models look weathered before actually doing any of the weathering steps is to use a dry brush to stipple the paint on and build it up in layers. It adds a really nice texture that you can't really get with an airbrush. The undercoat that I want to do for this is a dark brown rust color. I grabbed a big dry brush and loaded it up with a bunch of paint and started stippling it onto the shoulders. This will give a nice rusty base coat for the shoulders as well as give it a really subtle paint texture because of the way we're applying it very roughly. After that, I looked around the model and decided where else I wanted to put any of the white paint on the armor. Once that was all good, I started working my way up from lighter to lighter paints, using the same technique but a bit more controlled for each layer. First, I started with saddle brown, using a smaller dry brush to only paint the raised areas where the light would naturally catch, leaving the lower parts exposed to the dark rust color that we used before. After that, I grabbed tan, doing the exact same thing but with even less coverage and a smaller dry brush. I continued to work my way up with these lighter colors, finishing it off with a bone white only at the very tops of the armor. After that, I grabbed some reds and started picking out the helmet and the red accents on the armor. I applied it a bit thinner than I normally would, that way the grit and texture from underneath can come through a bit more on the red parts. Once that dried, I grabbed my lighter red and started picking out any of the areas that the light source from above would be hitting. I did it very painterly and rough to match the rest of the look on the armor. After doing some highlights, I mixed some white into the red paint to make a bright pink that I could dry brush catching all of the edges. To make those highlights look a little bit less pink, I used a red wash all over the red parts of the armor to tie it all together. I wanted to touch up the white parts of the armor a little bit more. I grabbed the brightest white paint that I had and with no moisture in my brush did lots and lots of light downward strokes on the shoulders, moving my brush from the top of the armor going down. This will highlight the very tops of the armor as well as give a sort of streaking effect as if the paint's starting to wear down and drip down the armor. Next up, we're going to add a lot of paint chips to the armor. I did this using the exact same dark rust paint that I used on the shoulders. I dipped a ripped up sponge into it, removed any excess on a paper towel, and then started dabbing it onto the model. This creates a really random pattern of paint chips, giving the impression that the paint on the armor has already been starting to chip off over time. For the parts that the sponge couldn't reach, I grabbed the smallest dry brush I had and did the exact same technique I did with the sponges. I wanted to do this before painting any parts that I don't want paint chips on, like the raw metal of the war gear and the exposed skin. This lets me be a little messier and less precise with my chipping since I don't have to worry about getting it anywhere that I don't want. Now that that's out of the way, we can finish brush painting all the parts that we left out. I started out by painting the faces. Only 2 of them have exposed faces, so I got those done first. I used a dark desaturated green as my first coat, making sure to leave a lot of fleshy red undertone underneath still visible. It adds a lot more visual interest and contrast with the bright green skin. I then hit it with a more vibrant green, catching only the raised areas. I kept working my way up slowly, introducing more and more vibrant greens, highlighting higher and higher points as I went along. I realized the red I was using to highlight wasn't bright enough to make it pop, so I grabbed the brightest red contrast paint I had and started picking out all the highest parts of the armor with it. Next up, I wanted to pick out any of the raw metal parts of the model, like the war gear, the pistons, and the backpacks. I used a darker gray with the biggest brush I had and loosely covered them with one coat. I'm not too worried about covering it all perfectly since a lot of this will be covered up in the next few steps of weathering. Now that we've got all the acrylic weathering done, we can start using some other types of paints to do the rest. The first step for the war gear was to dry brush them to make the details pop. I used a lighter neutral gray and dry brushed from the top down. It'll help keep the light source consistent. The dry brush can also leave some really light lines here and there, which can give the impression of scratches and scuff marks. Pigment powders are a great way to add some really vibrant colors to your models. And the great thing about pigment powders is you can actually mix them down with a bit of water to make a slurry that you can use almost like a wash. These are really saturated, which means it's really good for doing any sort of rust or verdigris effects. I dumped some orange rust colored pigment powder into a disposable cup and mixed it with some water until it became the consistency of a wash. Once it got liquidy enough, I started slopping it all over the metal parts of the model. Because of how liquidy it is, it'll naturally sort of flow into the cracks of the sculpt and dry there, making it look like rust accumulating in the recesses. I wasn't that worried about being clean with it since any part of the model I didn't like, I could just wipe away with a bit of water. Looking at the faces again, I felt like they were missing a little something. I grabbed the green speed paint and watered it down. Then I used a large brush and painted over the heads with it. Because speed paints are so transparent and vibrant, it'll kind of unify all the other layers of paint that I did on the head already, and it'll make it pop a lot more. Once the pigment's dried, I grabbed my dry brush and loaded it up with some silver paint. I wiped off the excess paint on a paper towel and started hitting most of the model with it. That slight bit of silver on all of the edges really makes the sharpest parts of the model pop. It also really helps sell the look for the war gear and backpacks looking like actual raw metal. Before moving forward with the final weathering steps, I wanted to touch up a few parts of the model that I was missing before. I picked out the goggles, the teeth, the bare orc heads, and also started adding some decorative stripes onto the helmets using the same grey and white paints I used on the shoulders. For the orcs with helmets, I used the same green paint from the bare orc heads to paint the orc symbol on the shoulders. This will sort of unify the ones with and without the helmets because now they both share that same green accent color. Once that was good, I grabbed some rattling grime contrast paint to pick out the pistons on the legs, then finished off the mechanical parts with a dry brush of Rise of Rust. This will give the previous rust effect a bit more pop to it. If you're trying to get a lot of models looking grimy and weathered really quickly, one of the best ways to do that is with enamel paints. At this point, it's a tale as old as time that streaking grime is the sacred nectar of GRIMDARK, and for good reason. It shades, tints, and weathers your models all in one step. Though I do have to say, please, if you're airbrushing enamels, make sure you're doing it in a well-ventilated space, you have a respirator, and some sort of lung protection. If being a hypochondriac has helped me with anything, it's for advocating for proper PPE usage. So just a bit of caution if you're using these things with an airbrush. My go-to enamel paints are AK Interactive Streaking Grime and Track Wash. Streaking Grime is great and a classic, but in this case I wanted to go with Track Wash. It has a bit more of a brown undertone to it rather than the green that Streaking Grime has, and I think the dark brown will kind of fit the vibe of these guys a little bit more. I loaded up my airbrush and started covering the models with it. The best part about airbrushing enamels is that you get a nice even coverage across all the models, you don't get any pooling, you waste less paint, and it dries way faster than if you were doing it with a brush and globbing it on. Once that was all done, I grabbed my gloves and began removing the grime from the larger surfaces of the model. Best way to do this is with white spirits. This is a paint solvent, which means it's really good at mopping up any excess paint. Once those were all good, I cleaned up my cutting mat and got ready to paint the bases. For the bases, I wanted to use a bit of color theory to make them stand out. What I decided on was a quadratic color combination. This essentially means that when you're looking at the four main colors used, when putting them on a color wheel, they form a square when drawn together. In this case, that would be the yellow, the red, and the green, and to complete that square, now a purplish blue color for the bases. To start my bases, I dry brushed straight over the black primer with a dark purpley red color, then started to work my way up dry brushing lighter and lighter purples and pinks. After that was good, I grabbed some white artist ink and watered it down, letting it flow into all the gaps and cracks on the bases. This will be important for the next step. While I had that same ink out, I did the same thing over the eye lenses on the helmets. I poured some of the white ink into my airbrush and went over the cracks to add a soft glow to it. I did the same thing very carefully over the eyes of the helmets as well. After that, I loaded up some neon green artist ink into my airbrush and went directly over the white I had just painted previously. The white gives a nice bright undercoat for the green to shine on, rather than if it was just painted directly over the purple bases. It'll make it pop a lot more. I gave some light puffs of the green on the eyes as well, also making sure to get some of that green on any parts of the armor that would catch the light from the helmets. Once that was all good to go, I glued down the orcs to their bases for the final step. I used the same neon green from earlier, only hitting the underside of the models, sort of emulating the light from the bases shining up and hitting the bottom of all of them. This will really help sell the look that the models are actually in the environment that they're standing on. After that, I could finally paint the rims of the bases black. These models were so much fun to work on. Sometimes I put off painting miniatures that I know I probably won't use in-game since it's not an army I play. Honestly though, these little projects are great as palette cleansers between painting other projects, and they're also a great way to force yourself to try techniques you normally wouldn't try otherwise. I also feel like I redeemed myself a bit from going a bit overboard on the object source lighting from the Marines video I did previously. I'm slowly starting to understand the workflow of it a bit better, and I want to try to implement it as much as I can in future projects. I'm so happy with how these guys turned out. I'm going to give another huge thanks again to Blueskyminis for supplying me with these STLs. He offered me these files months ago before I even started the channel, which gave me a ton of confidence that I could actually do this as a thing. So again, I just want to say thank you to him for that. Dude makes some really cool stuff, so if you want to check him out, feel free to check out his My Mini Factory page linked in the description below. I also just wanted to give a brief thank you to everyone for the insane attention and love that the first video got. I went in with like super low expectations when uploading that first video. I was not expecting more than like 30 views. So seeing it kind of skyrocket to like where it's at now in under a week was kind of crazy, and I didn't expect it. It definitely gave me a lot of confidence to like be able to continue doing this. I'm still not sure if we'll ever have like a proper release schedule anytime soon. I think videos are just going to come out when they come out. But seeing how much everyone really liked that video, I want to try to make these as frequently as I possibly can without burning myself out right away. I really look forward to sharing this hobby with everybody and getting to meet more people in the space. So yeah, once again, huge thank you for the support on the first video. The next video is going to be something a little special, so stay tuned for that hopefully soon. I'm halfway through filming it currently as of recording this, so I'm going to try to get that out hopefully by May, so keep an eye out for that. And with that, this has been Plaid Hobbies. Have a great night, and I'll see you in the next episode.
And now, folks, we thank you for joining us tonight. We hope this evening was filled with love and entertainment, and that you happily sleep through the night and join us again tomorrow. Good night, and sleep well.